It's time to look at the Level 2 content for commas from Chapter 16 from the Canadian Business English text. Our objectives will be to use commas correctly in punctuating independent adjectives, verbal phrases, and prepositional phrases. We will also use commas correctly in punctuating independent, introductory, terminal, and non-essential clauses. First, let's look at independent adjectives. Recall that an adjective is a word that modifies a noun or a pronoun. If you have two adjectives that equally modify a noun, they should be separated by a comma. In the sentence, many laborious, inefficient procedures are being eliminated. The noun is the word procedures, and the words laborious and inefficient are both equal adjectives that modify that noun, and are therefore separated by a comma. Next up, we'll look at introductory phrases. Verbal phrases that come at the beginning of a sentence should be followed by commas. Verbal phrases are covered in detail on page 201 of your text if you're confused what an introductory verbal phrase is. In brief, in the sentence, hoping to get a good seat, Sharda got to the seminar room early. Hoping to get a good seat is one of these verbal phrases that are introductory to the sentence. And similarly, to complete this order, we'll have to work overtime. Again, we have this introductory verbal phrase at the beginning of the sentence that's separated by a comma. Prepositions are something that I know you know a lot about. So if we have a look here at introductory prepositional phrases, if there are a total of 5 or more words, these should be followed by commas. For the past 6 months, we've had great success promoting our services in British Columbia. For the past 6 months is clearly a prepositional phrase. It starts with the preposition for. It has more than 5 or more words, and it's separated by a comma. Same thing for in the spring of this year. We introduced a new product in Alberta. Introductory prepositional phrases of fewer than 5 words do not require commas. On Monday, I called their sales representative 3 times. On Monday is not more than 5 words. Does not require a comma. Just like in Level 1, we'll look at non-essential phrases here. We use commas to set off phrases that interrupt the flow of a sentence with information not needed for grammatical completeness. In the sentence, Mark Young, explaining the bank's position, gave us the details of the new loan restrictions. Explaining the bank's details is a phrase that interrupts the flow of the sentence and is not needed. It's used for emphasis, and it needs to be separated with those commas. A reminder that we do not use commas to set off prepositional phrases that contain essential information. We do not at this time anticipate any problems. The prepositional phrase at this time is required and is essential information for this sentence to be grammatically complete. Now we'll look at independent clauses. When a coordinating conjunction joins independent clauses, use a comma before the conjunction unless the clauses are very short. So you can think of this as when you are using fanboys in a sentence to avoid a comma splice. Remember, when we have two complete sentences that are separated by a comma, we have to use one of those fanboys conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, and so forth, to separate. And we also use a comma in that case. The example, the computer is an efficient office tool, and it eliminates the need for some paperwork. If we didn't include the word and, we'd have a comma splice. So we include the word and we include the comma. In the second example, the clauses are very short and we don't need the comma. We have tried and we have succeeded. So those are independent clauses. Each part of the sentence can be in a sentence of its own, really, if you wanted to use a period instead of a comma in a conjunction. But when we look at dependent clauses, these use dependent words such as when, if, because. When these come at the beginning of a sentence, then the clause is followed by a comma. For example, when Lorena was hired, comma, she didn't realize she would have to train the staff in the use of Sears' new software. In the second example, if Mark applies, comma, he stands a good chance of getting the promotion. And finally, because we're late with this order, comma, we'll give them a 15% discount on the next one. So that was using dependent clauses at the beginning of the sentence. So now let's have a look if the dependent clause is being used at the end of the sentence. We only need a comma if the dependent clause is an afterthought. His duties were outlined when he was hired. There's no afterthought in that sentence. But if you compare that to, our office is open from 10 until 6, although we can make special arrangements when necessary. This is more of an afterthought that requires a comma. Okay, a couple more slides before we move on to the check your skill. This non-essential clauses is similar to what we've already seen. We use commas to set off parenthetical clauses, those that interrupt the flow of the sentence, and those that supply information not needed for the grammatical completeness of a sentence. Shelley Wall, as you remember, came well recommended. So the as you remember is a clause that is used for emphasis and is not necessary for the grammatical completeness. Same for the next example. Joan Hessler, who teaches at Wilfrid Laurier University, has just published an excellent article on this topic. Okay, stick with me. Last slide before we get into the check your skill. Do not use commas to set off dependent clauses that contain essential information. So we've seen again something similar to this. The professor who teaches our literature course has placed additional copies of the text on the reserve shelf. This is a necessary part. The who teaches our literature course is a necessary clause and is not separated by commas. The same thing in the next examples. The parcel that was delivered this morning contains the manuals we need for the workshop. The clause that was delivered this morning could definitely not be removed and make the sentence still grammatically complete. And same for parents who have 2 or more toddlers at home can rarely find time for themselves. So it's necessary to include the clause who have 2 or more toddlers at home for the sentence to make sense. It is check your skill time. So insert the necessary commas here. To make a good presentation, you must speak clearly and vividly. This is probably the most tricky part of the chapter, but here we have an introductory verbal phrase to make a good presentation, and therefore we need a comma. Here's another sentence. Julian Sims, who founded the company, lives in Acton. Did you notice that we have a non-essential clause here? Who founded this company? Then we need to have commas on each side of that non-essential clause. And here's another sentence. When she's away, Susan checks her messages daily. Can you tell where the comma needs to be in this sentence? Here we have an introductory clause that is dependent. It has one of those dependent words such as when. So because we have a dependent word, we need to include a comma after the dependent clause. When she is away, comma, Susan checks her messages daily. In the next sentence, can you tell where the necessary commas should be located? We need a self-motivated, industrious individual for this position. Here we have 2 equal independent adjectives that modify the noun individual. So self-motivated and industrious need to be separated by a comma. In the spring of each year, daylight is extended by 1 hour. Where might the commas go in this sentence? What we have here is we have a long introductory prepositional phrase. Remember, the word in is one of those prepositional words, and because our prepositional phrase has 5 or more words, then we include a comma to separate it at the beginning of the sentence. And next sentence. Jenny starts her day at 5 a.m. and Tom begins an hour later. Where might the commas go in this sentence? What we have here are 2 independent clauses that are being separated by a conjunction. Therefore, we need to have a comma before the conjunction. Jenny starts her day at 5 a.m., comma, and Tom begins an hour later. And another sentence. The person who prepared the report was accurate and thorough. All phrases, clauses, and other information in the sentence is essential, and therefore this sentence does not have any commas. Yep, I tricked you. I'm out of time for this video, so let's move on and do some pre-tests for this unit.